Chapter 13 of The Fortune Hunter, a novel of New York society by Cora Mowatt. A kind and tender heart for others wants to feel, a soul secure from fortune's dart, and bosom armed with steel, to bear divine chastisement's rod, and, mingling in my plan, submission to the will of God, with charity to man. J. Q. Adams. A month passed on. Esther Clinton considered herself, to use her own language, betrothed to Augustus Brainard. Yet she did not choose that her engagement should be made known even to her own family, or that her father's consent should be asked. She could find no pleasure except in stolen interviews, and often doubted that theirs could be true love, because its course ran so smooth. She longed for more excitement, and not infrequently determined to dismiss her lover, because she was weary of loving and being loved again, exactly like the rest of the world. She began to suspect that Brainard was not the being destined by uncontrollable fate to woo and win her, in spite of the most insurmountable difficulties, and to sacrifice wealth and fame and honor and happiness for the sake of sighing at her feet. Her only mode of varying the monotony of her existence was to quarrel with Arria. She insisted that she had been grossly injured, in what manner she did not choose to explain, by Miss Walton, and refused to hold any intercourse with her. When they met, she greeted Arria coldly, bestowing upon her the most reproachful glance, and turned away with a good deal of scornful looking beautiful on her lips. In vain Arria besought her to explain how she had offended her. In vain she reiterated that the coolness of her former friend was a source of grief, and in vain her pale countenance and sunken eyes had pleaded for her, and told that her heart was sufficiently full of sorrow, without the addition of a pang from the hand that once caressed. Esther maintained a perverse and tragically dignified silence, and repelled the warmest advances of the gentle sufferer. Mr. Chadwick Esther seldom saw, for he found that he could not visit the Clintons without raising hopes in his parents which he never intended to gratify. With Rachel he still kept up an intimacy, both because there was something pleasingly soothing in her society and conversation, and because he could talk of Arria to her and listen to accounts of their unfortunate friend. In the last month his character had undergone a remarkable change. He ever retained the hope that in some future period Arria would relent, for he could not relinquish it without relinquishing all ambition and all energy. Yet he grew thoughtful and even serious. It had been Arria's request, her earnest, her last and only request, that he would study the subject of religion, and for her sake he devoted many an hour to the examination of the most celebrated theological writings, and especially to the works of the most spiritual authors. At first he turned their pages from mere curiosity, and because it had been Arria's desire, but soon he found himself deeply interested. He took a new view of the subject of religion, and wondered at his own blindness and ignorance, in never before beholding the great truths of nature in this clear light, and though he yielded not at once his preconceived ideas, the foundation of skepticism was shaken, and the fabric tottered. Everything that was liberal, that was philosophical, that was high-minded, and free from the taint of bigotry and prejudice, accorded with his elevated character. In some authors he met with much that he could not comprehend, and much more that he could not credit. Yet he learnt enough to fully repay him for his researches. If Arria were only by my side, to tell me whether her views accorded with those conveyed in this passage, he would sigh sometimes. I almost think she would make me a Christian. But Arria, since their last interview, he had seen but rarely, only once at the residence of Miss Clinton, where he could converse with her, and then, although the expression of her face was resigned, even cheerful, although there was nothing in her mien which betokened sadness and repining, although she greeted him with kindness, the hand which she permitted him to momentarily clasp did not tremble, though her voice was clear and firm, and though she conversed with graceful ease ever natural to her, yet Edgar was so much affected by her presence that he soon was forced to retire. Where was the restless buoyancy that used to make that countenance continually sparkle all over? Where were the rosy gifts of health that once bloomed on her delicate cheek? What spell had hushed the ringing, joyous laugh that ever echoed by those who heard it? The playful sallies that inspired all others by her own mirth, what had become of them? But besides this, Arria's health was visibly declining. The roundness of her form had departed, her chest looked sunken, her shoulders contracted, and a low, hollow cough often broke like a knell on the ears of those who loved her. Her spirit's sudden strife had left its ravages on her person. True, the spirit was victorious over itself, but the frame was conquered also. She had seen her uncle several times since their last distressing meeting, and he was the same cold, reserved, and gloomy being that he had ever been, perhaps not colder than before, but certainly not more tender. Arria seldom left the house, but every Sunday, as she walked to church, she was sure of meeting Edgar. Mrs. Lemming was by Arria's side, and therefore he did not join them, yet they entered the same church door, and Edgar always took his seat in a pew in front of theirs. But to the prayers that were offered up he seldom responded. When others prayed, he was ever watching what more than earthly beauty devotion lent to the heavenly features of Arria. When they sang, he was listening to catch her seraphic tones as they ascended to heaven, and during the sermon he heard not, beheld not the preacher. He only saw the varying of Arria's countenance, and thus judged the beauty or imperfections of his doctrine. During the last month, Rachel Clinton's affection for Arria had greatly increased. Many a long morning she whiled away in her society, and they plied their needles faster than ever. Arria never dared to be idle. Employment was her great refuge from her afflicting thoughts. She seldom spoke of her griefs to Rachel, and when she did, she would sometimes say, "What can equal Shakespeare's knowledge of human nature? Every day I realize the truth of his sentiment. Do you not remember, dearest Rachel, that he says, 'I can teach 20 men what were good to be done, than one of the 20 to follow mine own teaching'? Look what a good teacher and good preacher you used to find in me, how I used to hold forth upon the best mode of being happy in spite of affliction, and see now how badly I follow mine own teaching." But if Arria had not profited by her own doctrines, Rachel had. She had made up her mind never to repine, to extend her sphere of use, to find enjoyment in all the little occupations in life, and to fit herself to be of service to everybody with whom she was thrown into contact. Her want of beauty now never disturbed her. Self no longer entered into her calculations. Her affectionate disposition made her long to be loved, especially by her parents and sister, and though she sometimes despaired of winning their affection, she became only more fixed on her determination to deserve it. One feeling in vain she endeavored to suppress. It was her growing interest in Mr. Allen. He visited their home frequently, and it was almost impossible to be insensible to the charm of his polished manners, his agreeable conversation, and his highly cultivated mind. "Who can he come to see?" mused Rachel. "He does not seem to devote himself to Esther, and yet it must be she. I should be a fool indeed if I flattered myself that my society was of any consequence to him. No, he certainly cannot come to see me, and I must try to think less of him, or think of him only as a brother-in-law. Would I then, much as I esteem him, desire to see him as a husband of Esther? Why not? But would she make him happy? Pshaw! If he loves her, he can mold her to his will, and it must be my task to assist him. Mr. Allen had requested Miss Clinton's permission to present her to an especial friend of his, a foreigner. The gentleman, he informed her, was a German, and a confirmed invalid, traveling in search of health. He had visited this country for a short time some 15 or 20 years ago, but was quite a stranger in the city, and Mr. Allen thought he would take some great pleasure in the society of Miss Clinton. He was a man of wealth, yet seemed to have lived a secluded life, and to take little interest in the affairs of the gay world. "I think him," concluded Mr. Allen, "of a rather desponding turn of mind. He appears the victim of a settled melancholy, notwithstanding which he has so much interested me during his voyage, for we crossed the Atlantic together, that I have a great desire you should make his acquaintance, and exert your powers in enlivening him." Rachel instantly gave her consent to the introduction, and the next evening Mr. Allen presented to her his friend Mr. Ehrenstein. Rachel found that Mr. Allen's description had been faithful, and in spite of Mr. Ehrenstein's seriousness, he was very conversable. He could not have reached his 40th year, yet he looked prematurely old. His hair was almost white, and his fine brow was thickly furrowed with lines of thought and grief. There was an urbanity, a warmth about his demeanor, which, mingling with his habitual sadness, awakened a deep and irresistible interest. He spoke with enthusiasm of his native country, yet seemed to have an affection for America, and that affection, he said, was the offspring of old associations. Altogether, Rachel was much gratified by his visit, and cordially expressed her desire to see him frequently. A few days after Mr. Ehrenstein's visit, she said to Arria one afternoon, "Come, Arria, you must put on your bonnet, for I am determined you shall spend this evening with me. Come, I will take no excuse, so get ready. I hope our interesting German will be here tonight, for I want you to see him." Arria begged that Rachel would excuse her, as she found of late that any exposure to the night air increased her cough. "But this evening the air is quite balmy," returned Rachel, "so you must come. Here is a blanket shawl. Wrap it well around you, and I will ensure you're not catching cold." Arria was too loath to deprive her friend of the pleasure to refuse any longer, and accompanied her home. They found Brainard in the parlor with Esther, but Arria kept so closely to Rachel's side that in spite of his evident desire, he had no opportunity of addressing a word to her which should reach her ear alone. It was painful for Arria to remain in the room with Esther, whose coldness seemed only to have increased, and equally distressing to be obliged to parry Mr. Brainard's attempt to converse with her in an undertone. She therefore withdrew Rachel to the back parlor, under the plea that the little dresses they were cutting out for Rachel's charity children could be better managed on an empty table which stood there than any other. They had hardly seated themselves at their work when, to Rachel's great delight, Mr. Allen and his friend were ushered into the front parlor. Rachel hastened into the room, bidding Arria to follow her. She, however, remained behind to finish a few important stitches, then, carefully folding the dresses, entered the parlor. Rachel rose, and, as Arria came forward, presented her to Mr. Ehrenstein. That gentleman also left his seat, and, as the bright light of the chandelier fell full upon Arria's countenance, he started back, as though an apparition stood before him. His hand grasped the table near him for support. Every limb grew stiff, as though petrified. The hue of life fled rapidly from his cheeks and lips. His jaw fell. The dilated eyes that were fixed, as though spellbound, upon Arria's face, slowly closed, and he fell back insensible. Mr. Allen sprung forward in time to break his fall, and the whole company gathered round to offer their assistance. Arria had the presence of mind to seek a pitcher of water, which she dashed unhesitatingly into his face. But it was some time before he recovered. When at length his eyes unclosed, he stared wildly about him, and the first words he spoke were, Where is she? Where's she gone? Let me see her again." "Of whom do you speak?" inquired Rachel in a kind tone, as she leaned over him, wiped the moisture from his forehead. "Of Edith. My Edith. Where is she?" "He is not quite recovered," said Rachel. "We must give him more air." Everybody moved back at her request, and at that moment Mr. Ehrenstein again caught the sight of Arria. He lifted himself on his elbow, gazed at her intently, and the name Edith again rose to his lips. Arria, from a natural impulse of kindness, bent toward him to inquire if he was better. He stretched out his hand, touched her forehead, as though to discover whether she was indeed a living being, and withdrawing it, exclaimed, "Who are you?" "My friend, to whom I just introduced you," replied Rachel, "Miss Arria Walton." "Walton, Walton," murmured the stranger to himself. "And so like Walton. I have never heard that name before. Have I never seen you, then?" "Not until tonight," replied Arria mildly. "But you are ill. Had you not better approach the window?" Mr. Ehrenstein took no notice. Again and again he repeated, "Mein Gott, mein Gott," surveying the fair girl between every ejaculation, as though she recalled some painful memory which he would have gladly forgotten. Little by little he regained his composure, but the only excuse which he made for his emotion was expressed in the words, "Forgive me, I am a dreamer." To break the unpleasant pause which ensued, Rachel ordered tea. It was quickly served, and Mr. Ehrenstein, who had hardly moved his eyes from Arria's face, was so much restored by a cup of the refreshing beverage that he was strong enough to take a seat beside her and enter into conversation. "You must think my conduct very strange," said he, "but you are so strongly resemble a dear friend I once had, a friend who is long since dead. We will not talk of it. I have not breathed her name for years. It is a pleasure for me to sit beside you." Arria thanked him, and they soon evinced such natural enjoyment in each other's society that when Arria left the house that night, she thought to herself that it was the happiest evening she had passed since the memorable one on which Edgar had escorted her home. Chapter 14. Matchless knave! What, not one blush of conscience on thy cheek? Coleridge. "I cannot give her up. No human being ever before exerted such an influence over me. The very sight of her last night roused my every dormant feeling, and her image has ever been before my eyes ever since. And what risk do I run? Even should Esther discover that I visited her quondam friend, she thinks herself too certain of my adoration. She has not sufficient humility and mistrust of her own charms to become jealous. The deuce take her! I wish you would bring matters to a close. When once the knot is tied, I shall be easy. However, there is no present need of my making myself miserable. The money I borrowed from those usurious Jews has temporarily settled Mr. Badger's claims. My only fear is that, with his usual prying ingenuity, he will manage to discover what other debts there are against me, and it will be quite in character if he had the impudence to solicit their being placed in his hands, and as sure as into his hands they do get, he gets me into their clutches. But what has that to do with Arria? The beautiful, gentle, peerless Arria. See her I will, win her I must, and for the rest, trust to luck. If fate befriends me, I shall be the most fortunate dog that walks the streets." Thus mused Mr. Brainard, after he had finished poring over the newspaper an hour after breakfast. Before another hour had quite elapsed, he found himself at Mr. Lemming's door. When it opened to him, he had too much tact to inquire if Miss Walton was at home, but, slipping a propitiatory piece of silver into the hand of a domestic, he bade her tell Miss Walton that a gentleman who had something particular to communicate desired to see her. When Arria received this message, she hastened to the parlor in some alarm, and great was her surprise on finding herself rapturously greeted by Mr. Brainard. "You do not bring me bad news, I hope?" inquired Arria, not entirely recovered from her emotion. "I bring you nothing worse than myself. Do not make me miserable by esteeming it evil tidings to hear of my presence," was the tender answer. "I have no doubt that Mrs. Lemming will be happy to see you, Mr. Brainard, but she is at present not at home, and if you will permit me to speak freely, she prefers it that I should not receive visitors at all in the morning, nor at any time in her absence. But Miss Walton, Arria, permit me to call you by that sweet name, beautiful Arria, me you will receive, and more than receive, for you will listen to me. Have I not told you that I love you? My only hope in life is to win your love in return. Mr. Brainard, you have once before distressed me by speaking in this manner, and I flattered myself that my answer would have prevented your ever alluding to the subject again. But I know that you would relent when you saw my utter wretchedness. You knew little of me if you supposed that the feelings and intentions which I so clearly avowed to you a few weeks ago could have undergone such a total change," replied Arria. "But you have not yet heard what I have to say, nor can I hear anything further," was Arria's determined answer. "You will now excuse me, Mr. Brainard, but I have engagements which render it necessary that I should shorten this interview. Good morning." Arria was advancing towards the door, but Mr. Brainard sprang impetuously forward and prevented her escape. Before she could turn, his arm encircled her waist, and she felt his hot breath upon her cheek. At the same moment the door opened, and Mrs. Lemming, in bonnet and shawl, stood before the embarrassed pair. Mr. Brainard instantly relinquished his grasp, and stooped to pick up Arria's pocket-handkerchief, that there might be some excuse for the crimson hue that dyed his face. Arria appeared overwhelmed with confusion, and her colour varied from scarlet to white, and from white to scarlet, almost with every pulsation of her heart. Her very innocence made her look a criminal. Mrs. Lemming advanced into the room, and throwing off her hat, seated herself upon the sofa with the air of a judge prepared to pass the harshest sentence which the law would permit upon the two delinquents before her. As soon as Arria's tongue obeyed her will, she presented Mr. Brainard to Mrs. Lemming as a friend of the Miss Clintons. Mrs. Lemming bowed coldly, and Mr. Brainard was too much abashed to do more than return the bow, and stammer out something about his being just on the point of bidding Miss Walton good morning, as he had a pressing engagement at that hour, adding that he hoped to have the pleasure of seeing Mrs. Lemming again. The lady replied by another formal bow, and Mr. Brainard took his leave. "And so, Miss Arria, this pet, the favourite, the modest young lady who Mr. Lemming thinks can be trusted everywhere, this young lady I find coquetting with a strange gentleman in my parlour, with his arm around her waist, and her cheek not an inch from his lips. If I had not inopportunely interrupted you, I suppose they would soon have been somewhere nearer. Oh, you artful little hussy! You succeeded in deceiving everybody else with your pretended amiability and gentleness and affection, but I saw from the beginning that there was too much of it to be natural. I always knew what you were at bottom, and now I hope I shall be believed. "Indeed, my dear Mrs. Lemming," pleaded Arria tearfully, "you did not comprehend the situation in which I was placed." "Don't say a word, miss. I comprehended it only too well, and your uncle shall comprehend it also. As for Mr. Lemming, we'll see what he has to say about his favourite now." Mrs. Lemming's voice was raised to so high a pitch of indignation that it disturbed her husband, whose study was in the adjoining room. The sound of his beloved Arria's voice in reply made him close his book and enter the apartment from whence the voices proceeded. "Oh, there you are, Mr. Lemming. You have come just in time. I hope that you will believe me in future, and think that I have some discernment. Here I found Miss Arria standing with a gentleman's arm around her, and her lips and his in the very act of making themselves better acquainted. There's modesty for you, there's innocence. Isn't it exactly as I always told you?" Indeed, Mrs. Lemming unintentionally mispresents. "Do you dare deny it before my face, miss?" Arria would have replied, but Mr. Lemming turned to her and said calmly, "Arria, child, retire to your chamber." There was not the slightest expression of mistrust on his countenance, nor of rebuke in his voice, for he was too thoroughly acquainted with Arria's character to doubt her. Arria joyfully obeyed his command. "I tell you what, Mr. Lemming," said the lady to her husband when they were alone, "you must get rid of that girl as quick as you can. I don't want her in my house any longer. Her ladyship is a perfect mistress here. Instead of people's coming to see me, it's always Miss Arria they ask for, and Miss Arria they must find somewhere else in the future." "I am very sorry that you are so prejudiced against her, my dear, for, as her uncle has placed her under my protection, I intend that she shall remain here." "And how does her uncle compensate you, pray? He hasn't paid you a cent for these 3 months, and I dare say Miss Arria, with all her dignity, is quite content to eat the bread of idleness and charity." "Though her uncle should never pay me a farthing, she would not be eating the bread of charity, for she is continually employed for you. Be that as it may, it is my desire that she shall not be molested." Mr. Lemming left his spouse to plan ways and means by which she might rid herself of her offensive inmate. Arria's crime was unpardonable in Mrs. Lemming's eyes. She, a penniless, obscure girl, to receive more attention, more invitations, and a great number of visits, than the person by whose bounty she was supported. It was unendurable, and Mrs. Lemming made up her mind not to endure it. Chapter 15. The worm in the bud preys on her damask cheek. Shakespeare. "I am sure she is dying," said Rachel Clinton to Mr. Lemming a few days after the occurrence related in the preceding chapter took place. "Look how rapidly she has faded during the last week. I at first thought that grief preyed upon her mind, but she does not seem to grieve and never complains. Yet how feeble she has grown! She coughs incessantly, and the hectic flush on her cheek is a bad sign." "My dear Miss Clinton, you alarm me. Do you really suppose that my poor Arria is in any danger? I will go for Dr. Chadwick immediately." "Have you much confidence in him as a physician?" "I cannot say I have ever tested his skill, but he is very celebrated, and he has attended Arria before." "Pray do not lose time, then. He ought to see her to-day." Mr. Lemming was too much attached to his young pupil to need this warning. He bent his steps immediately to Dr. Chadwick's residence. Dr. Chadwick was from home, and Mr. Lemming wrote the name of Miss Walton upon his slate, with the request that he would call at his earliest convenience. Shortly after Mr. Lemming's visit, Edgar Chadwick, who was prosecuting his studies, came to seek a medical work in his father's office. Accidentally, his eyes fell on the slate, and he read the name of Arria. She was ill, perhaps in danger. She might die. Without pausing for a moment's reflection, he left the house, and never slackened his pace until he stood beneath Arria's window. His furious ring was quickly answered, and he recognized the faithful Irish girl who had delivered him Arria's letter. "Biddy, is it you? Tell me quickly, how is Miss Walton?" "Sure it is me, sir, but the young lady's poorly, quite poorly. There's not a servant in the house but feels downhearted about her." "You must contrive to let me see her, Biddy. Is Mrs. Limming at home?" "Yes, sir, but she hasn't given any orders about of late. She's busy with the pastry in the kitchen, and if you'll just walk quiet-like into the parlour, I'll never let on to her that you are here at all, but get Miss Arria down to see you before you can snap your finger." Away ran the girl, and she was as good as her word, for Arria followed her as she descended the stairs. "This is kind, dearest Arria. How shall I thank you?" "If it is kind, Edgar, Mr. Chadwick, thank me by saying nothing which I would not desire to hear." "I will endeavor to do so. You are ill, my beloved Arria. You are suffering, and I am not permitted to be by you and to soothe you." "Rachel is very kind to me, and so is everybody, and I am not in much pain." A very stylish gig at that moment drew up before the door, and Dr. Chadwick alighted. Edgar was too much absorbed by the fair and fading being before him to remember that his presence might awaken his father's displeasure, but Arria, who seemed ever to have a perception of others' feelings, was immediately troubled by the thought that Dr. Chadwick might be annoyed, that he might doubt the course that she had pursued, and become incensed with his son equally with herself. She rose from her seat, looked out of the window, then toward the door, and then at Edgar, made a few uncertain steps forward, and finally sat down again. The possibility of her having become acquainted with his father's opposition to their union now, for the first time, crossed the mind of Edgar. But before he could question Arria on the subject, Dr. Chadwick entered the room. The doctor's face was the worst possible index to his thoughts, and his feelings were never telegraphed by his manners. This equanimity was seldom disturbed except in his family circle. The same easy suavity of address, the same imperturbability of deportment always characterized him. The certain queries, expressions of condolence, of approbation, seemed stereotyped upon his lips. Not a muscle of his face denoted either surprise or displeasure when he found his son seated by Arria's side. He saluted them both with grave condescension, and very businesslike indeed was his air, as he placed himself in an armchair directly in front of Arria. "I am very sorry to hear that you are indisposed, my dear young lady. We must get you well again. Nothing serious, I imagine, that is, nothing alarming. We'll soon put all the wheels in order." Dr. Chadwick paused, and, with the head of his cane at its familiar point of consultation, his lips, looked Arria steadily in the face. When he had finished his survey, he turned to Edgar and said, "My son, I have some professional questions to ask Miss Walton, and you must excuse her at present." It was with very marked unwillingness that Edgar rose, and quite regardless of his father's presence, he addressed Arria. "You must permit me to see you again, dear Arria, that I may have the happiness of witnessing your rapid recovery." A faint smile stole over Arria's face, but she bade him adieu without answering his question. When his son had gone, Dr. Chadwick drew near Arria, and, taking her almost transparent hand in his, pressed his finger upon her pulse. Apparently its beating was too faint to be immediately discoverable, for he remained some minutes in the same position, maintaining the most solemn silence. When he withdrew his finger, it was to say inquiringly, "My son, my dear young lady, do not suppose that I ever doubted your word, but have you kept your promise to me, that is, kept it strictly?" "Yes, replied Arria in a low tone. "I have kept it." "Right, quite right. I am glad to see you bearing it so bravely. These little trials, my dear, are what we must all expect to meet in the world, and the sooner we make up our minds to take them easy, the better. Did you say that you saw Edgar often?" "Very seldom. I have seen him but twice in this house since—" "I understand, since the advice I gave you. Quite right. There is no use of reviving old feelings. Edgar is a headstrong fellow, and without the proper management would give his mother and myself a great deal of trouble. You must not encourage his visits, my dear young woman. It will be better for both of you if you see but little of each other." "I agree with you. It was not my intention to encourage them." "Just so. That's exactly how it should be. And now we must see what is the matter with you. We shall have you well in a day or two." After a few inquiries, Dr. Chadwick wrote a prescription for his patient, and requested her to tell Mrs. Lemming that he had a few words to say to her. Arria's failing strength made it a relief when her interview with Dr. Chadwick was at an end, and she hastened to communicate his desire to Mrs. Lemming. "Your young friend is quite indisposed, my dear Mrs. Lemming," said Doctor, when the lady presented herself, "quite indisposed, and I particularly request that she be kept quiet. That is to say, she must not receive too many visits. I found my son with her this morning, and after what has passed it would be wise, my dear lady, if you gave orders to your domestics to let him understand that Miss Walton is not well enough to receive company." Mrs. Lemming violently disclaimed all knowledge of young Chadwick's visit, declared Miss Arria to be the most artful person whom it had ever been her ill fortune to meet, and gave Dr. Chadwick a very forcible, highly colored account of the situation in which she had found Mr. Brainard and this very modest young lady. The doctor noted every word, and on his return home, of course, as a mere matter of conversation, repeated the whole affair to his wife. "Mr. Brainard, did you say?" inquired Mrs. Chadwick. "Why, that is the very young man who is supposed to be engaged to Esther Clinton, the very young man who interferes with our plans." That very afternoon Mrs. Chadwick ordered her coach at an early hour, for, she declared, it had just occurred to her that she had several visits, which it was incumbent upon her to pay immediately. The first one was to her very dear and inestimable friend, Mrs. Clinton. In the course of the conversation she inquired of that lady if there was any truth in the report that her beautiful daughter Esther was engaged to a Mr. Brainard. "Oh, no engagement has taken place," replied Mrs. Clinton. "The gentleman is desperately in love with my sweet daughter, but then who is not?" "My mind is quite relieved," rejoined Mrs. Chadwick, "by learning that they are not engaged, for, entre nous, I have no very great opinion of the gentleman. I fear also that he was playing false to your charming daughter. Do you know, I have heard, but this is a secret, it must go no further?" "Oh, certainly not. You may rely on me. I have heard," continued Mrs. Chadwick, lowering her voice to a whisper, "that the other day he was found in the most disgraceful position towards Miss Arria Walton, in one for which there could be no excuse unless he was decidedly her lover." "You don't say so! Miss Arria? Is it possible? Well, who would have supposed such a demure little girl would have permitted any improper liberty?" "You see there's no trusting appearances, my dear Mrs. Clinton. I am convinced this Brainard is a very dangerous man. He is totally incapable of appreciating your charming Estelle, and if he has addressed her, it was for the sake of her fortune. Indeed, I have great reason to believe so, for he has not a farthing in the world." This was quite gratuitous information on the part of Mrs. Chadwick, for she was not in the least degree aware of that she was speaking the precise truth. "Why, you quite alarm me," replied Mrs. Clinton. "Now that I reflect upon it, I dare say you are right. Do you know, the other evening the most strange-looking and impertinent individual called here upon this very Brainard? It occurred to me afterward that he looked very much like a collector, and Brainard was dreadfully agitated while he talked to him, but Brainard told us he was only a madman. A likely story. No doubt he was a collector. I advise you, my dear Mrs. Clinton, to warn Miss Estelle immediately. She is young and unsuspicious. It is your duty to place her upon her guard." For once the advice was not lost. The instant Mrs. Chadwick concluded her visit, Mrs. Clinton summoned Estelle and communicated to her all the information she had received, finishing her discourse by the declaration that she could not endure Brainard and wished it was possible to put an end to his visits. To her mother's astonishment, Esther, when she heard this, heroically declared herself engaged to Brainard, said that she adored him, that she would sooner part with life than be separated from him, that she had ever looked forward to these persecutions, and that now she was prepared to bear them, for that no earthly power should sever her heart from the heart to which it was united. This was just the excitement, the persecution she termed it, for which Esther had so long pined. An hour before she was ready to discard her lover, because the current of their love ran too smoothly, and now that objections were offered to their union, now that she had good reasons for really discarding him, she was determined to cling to him through life and death. All her mother's representations and persuasions only served to render her firmer. She said she knew that love was a faith whose martyrs are the broken heart, and to become martyr, although she did not add that, was the reigning desire of her soul. Mrs. Clinton had seldom courage to thwart her favorite's wishes, but in this instance she determined to consult her husband, and through his aid to discover some method of convincing Esther of Brainard's true character. Meantime, Esther fed and prolonged the incitement she so much loved by writing the most extravagant letter to Brainard, and detailing to him the persecutions to which they were subjected, concluding with the most pathetic assurances that they would live, suffer, and die together, and that the powers of the united universe should never separate them. Chapter 16. A partner suited to my mind, solitary, pleased, and kind, who partially may something see, preferred to all the world in me, sliding by my humble side, fame and splendor, wealth and pride. Countess of Wynchley. Rachel Clinton was not immediately aware of the communication which her mother was making to Esther, for at that period of Mrs. Chadwick's visit she was sitting in her own little boudoir, but not, as usual, sitting in solitude. Mr. Allen, who was paying her a visit, had requested to see some of her drawings, and for the first time she had admitted him into her sanctum, partly because she was too modest to display her own skill or lack of skill in the parlor, where casual visitors were continually entering, and partly because Mr. Allen followed her, uninvited, when she went to seek her portfolio. Furthermore, he seemed to think the little car sofa in Rachel's boudoir far more comfortable than any lounge which the drawing-room contained, and, once seated, expressed great unwillingness to change his position. Both parties seemed less at ease than usual, and many long, awful pauses occurred in their conversation, which Rachel tried to relieve by displaying the contents of her portfolio. a proceeding which plainly showed that her thoughts were wandering, for, in general, her mauvaise honte made her almost painfully reluctant to display her own performances. "It has been almost a month since I have seen your friend Mr. Ehrenstein," said Rachel, by way of suggesting some new topic. "Yes, I think I told you that he was ill ever since the evening he passed here. His mind seemed to have received some severe shock. In what manner I cannot understand, but he has not left his room for a month, and his melancholy has greatly increased. He was affected, I believe, by the strong likeness which he traced in Miss Walton to some deceased friend? Yes, thus much he told me, but the subject appeared to be so painful one that I did not induce him to dwell upon it. A number of questions concerning Miss Walton, which I answered to the best of my ability. She is an orphan, and the niece of Mr. Lemming, is she not? Oh, no, her uncle's name is Mordaunt. Mr. Lemming was formerly her teacher, he is now her protector. Then I made a gross mistake, but I presume it is hardly worth while correcting, as, in the present state of my friend's nervous system, the mere mention of her name affects him. Did I not hear Miss Walton herself was ill? Yes, poor Arria! Nobody will feel her loss more than I shall. Yet I have a presentiment that she is rapidly passing to a brighter sphere. I am convinced that she is a victim to consumption. She is so quiet and uncomplaining that none of her friends yet realize it, but I have passed the night and day with her, and am too familiar with the cares of this kind to be deceived. I said that nobody realized her situation, but I mistake. Her uncle appears to me to be aware of it. He is a cold, harsh man, but once or twice lately I have seen him regard her with the tenderest pity. It was only last night that, for the first time in his life, he returned her affectionate kiss, and then passed his hands hastily over his eyes, as though he feared they were moistened. Is she much changed? Yes, very visibly. She has not lost her wondrous beauty? Some of her beauty I think she has lost, for it consisted in the varying, beaming brightness of her face, in the buoyant sense of being which seemed to animate her whole frame, and these have entirely vanished. But her loveliness has only increased. She is calm and very still, though never sad. Sometimes she moves like one in a dream, as though her thoughts were contemplating a state of holier happiness than is permitted to us on earth, and yet she has not lost her interest in the affairs of everyday life. She pursues her usual occupations with the same energy, and is always ready to discuss any new project we have on foot, and to lend her aid. Her character has become perfected as of late, and when I remember that whom the gods love die young, I cannot think that she will live. She is a strangely interesting being. She is, indeed. Again there was a pause. Rachel scattered about the loose sheets in her portfolio, and Mr. Allen employed himself by twisting the leaves of a pamphlet that lay beside him into dog's ears. When he had sufficiently disfigured the book to become aware of what he was doing, he threw it by and said, "Rachel." Rachel colored deeply, for it was the first time he had ever addressed her by her Christian name. "I wish, Rachel, that you could divine all that I would say." Rachel stammeringly expressed her inability to do so. "Tell me, at least, that I do not offend you when I call you by the familiar name of Rachel." "You are quite welcome to call me so, but that name does not happen to be a very beautiful one. It acquires its beauty from the spirit of its possessor. Will you believe that, to me, it is the dearest name on earth?" Rachel could hardly credit her ears. She had long striven to check the affection which was springing up in her own heart. She was convinced that it could never be returned, and when she found that her thoughts continually dwelt upon Mr. Allen and his estimable qualities, She persuaded herself that she only entertained a high esteem for him, and called her warmest emotions by the convenient name of friendship. She now sat trembling before him, not daring to meet his eye, lest he should read in her heart what she was not aware until this moment that an invisible finger had written there. She strove to reply, but the unmeaning words she attempted to frame died away upon her lips. "You do not answer me, dear Rachel. You do not tell me whether I may hope to win a wife who wears the name which I have learned to love. Yet I look to you only for an answer." "To me? What attraction could you have ever found? How could I have ever endeared the name to you?" No, I have grossly misunderstood your meaning," said Rachel, involuntarily, and with uncontrollable agitation. "Not so, my own Rachel. I may call you mine, may I not? And to prove to you that you have not misunderstood me, I will answer you your questions. If the answer proves a long one, you must be patient. For several years past, I have been called a woman-hater, because I mistrusted your sex too much to take pleasure in their society. But you have not found me one, have you? I entered life with brilliant prospects and without experience. My temperament was warm, and soon I became deeply enamored of a beautiful girl who had hardly attained her 18th year. I offered myself and was instantly accepted. Fortunately, I was not totally blinded by my passion, and I endeavored to study the character of my future wife. I found her full of envy and the slave of her own passions. She entertained the bitterest feelings of animosity towards those of her own sex, whose beauty vied with hers. To hear them admired made her miserable. She lived in the very breath of adulation, yet, in spite of this, she fascinated me, and I loved her and persuaded myself that I could correct these errors of her character and education. But I did not know then how thoroughly selfish was her nature. The dreadful suspicion soon entered my mind that she was incapable of returning my affection, and had merely accepted my hand because it was reported that I was a man of wealth. To test her love, I one day hinted that I found my affairs much involved, and that I had many fears for the future. We were passing a fortnight at Saratoga. She did not reply at the time to what I said, but before we left the Springs, she was engaged to a gouty old millionaire, and coolly informed me that she did not think we were suited to each other. I loved her well enough to make a fool of myself for a while, and when I recovered my senses, I very illiberally concluded that artfulness, calculation, and selfishness were the characteristics of the whole sex. I suppose you will dispute that I had come to my senses, but I thought I had. For several years I mingled but seldom in society, and resentfully eschewed all intercourse with your sex. By the persuasion of a friend, I was induced to accompany him to Miss Adair's ball. I considered myself a spectator, and not a participator in the festivities, and found my principal amusement in watching the manoeuvres of the company, every individual of whom appeared bent upon accomplishing some particular purpose. It was then that my eye fell upon you. You were following your beautiful sister about, performing 1,000 kind offices for her, and evidently gratified by the admiration which she elicited. When she danced, you seated yourself without the slightest appearance of mortification at being neglected, and I observed that you made yourself agreeable to the ladies beside you, and seemed to enjoy the gay scene as much as anybody present. I asked your name of Mr. Ellery, whom I saw speaking to you a few moments previous, and from him I learnt some particulars of your history. You were an heiress, and your hand had often been sought in marriage, and yet you had too little vanity to suppose that you had inspired a tender affection, and determined to renounce the advantages of wealth, that you might find sincerity. You were neglected by your former lovers, and yet entertained no pique towards them, or the world in general, and could find happiness in performing kind offices for others. This is really a noble woman, I thought to myself. Here is one breast in which the monster self has never been enthroned. I requested an introduction to you. The better I knew you, the more I esteemed, nay, loved you. Answer me one word. Have I wasted my affection, or have I laid it out at usury to find it brings back twice its value? Rachel answered, but that inarticulate, disjointed answer it would be impossible to repeat, for Rachel herself hardly knew what she was saying. Yet her reply was all that her lover could have desired, and as he looked upon her glowing cheeks and pressed her to his heart, he inwardly exclaimed, "Who that saw her now could say she was not lovely?" Chapter 17. Thou here? It was not thou whom here I came to seek. Coleridge. "Now, my dear husband," said Mrs. Clinton to her liege lord, as she was arranging their places in the china breakfast service, "you really must do something about this affair. I know that Brainard is a good-for-nothing, idle, dissipated, penniless young fellow. I know it on good authority, and he shall not marry my daughter." "I hope not, my dear, but what can I do? Has he never even proposed for her?" "Did I not tell you that he had, my dear, and that Estelle told me herself that she was engaged to him and would marry him? It would break my heart to see her throw herself away in such a manner. There's young Edgar Chadwick. I would much rather see her his wife, and Mrs. Chadwick is such a delightful woman. She would be such pleasant company for me, and then the doctor would always be at hand, and there is not a physician in New York like him." "Very good, you may arrange all that between yourselves. But why have you taken such a dislike to Mr. Brainard? Did not Ellery tell us that his father left him $100,000? "Yes, but I do not believe a word of it. A man came here after him the other day who looked for all the world like a collector." "And what do you wish me to do?" "Merely to call upon him this morning, and so turn the conversation that he will be obliged to speak of his intentions towards Esther. Then ask him what is the state of his circumstances, and let him know that, at all events, he shan't have your consent." "A very pleasant errand, truly. You are so fond of management, wife. I wish you could manage it all yourself." "Nonsense! Why can't you do it? Now promise me you will call upon him this very morning." "Certainly I will call upon him, if you desire it, but men always make a bungling mess of such matters. We have not the tact of women. I will call upon and discover what I can do, for if your representation of Brainard is a true one, he certainly shall not marry my daughter." "That is right. Now go. Be sure you give him his walking ticket. That delightful Mrs. Chadwick can't endure him, nor can I." Mr. Clinton was one of those quiet, systematic men who hate to have the daily routine they are accustomed to pursue interrupted, and who have yet a greater hatred of all domestic dissension. He knew that, for the preservation of his household peace, he must comply with his wife's request, and, therefore, determined to pay a visit to Mr. Brainard forthwith. As he entered Mr. Brainard's luxurious apartments, that gentleman was sitting with his back to the door, his head leaning upon his hands, his brows knit, his eyes glancing uneasily over a suspicious-looking strip of paper which lay on the table in front of him. Directly opposite to Mr. Brainard sat another gentleman, in an attitude of the most perfect ease and enjoyment, With his club foot tenderly extended upon a chair, he was puffing every once in a while a wreath of smoke through his nostrils, and ejaculating with every puff, "Capital cigar! Capital! You're La Norma! Capital, my dear fella!" Mr. Clinton advanced in front of the table before he attracted the attention of either gentleman. Mr. Brainard raised his eyes at the sound of the steps and arose confusedly from his seat. "Mr. Clinton, how do you do?"
"How do you do? How are you? Happy to see you again, I mean. Haven't forgotten me, I hope. Did some business for you 5 years ago at the time of the great failures. Everything going to ruin then. Banks broken. Everybody blown up. Great country. This great country."
Mr. Badger rubbed his hands briskly together, as though there was something exhilarating in his reflection upon these little disasters. Mr. Clinton returned his salutation with a bow, and Mr. Brainard, glancing fiercely at Badger, placed a chair for his guest. "I'm afraid I have interrupted you," said Mr. Clinton. "Oh, not at all," replied Brainard boldly. "I was only transacting a little business with Mr. Badger here. I have heard so much of his ingenuity that I had just determined to try his skill in the collection of some money for me, which I had given up as lost. I was just looking over the account."
"That's all, my dear sir," said Badger, before Clinton could reply. "The exact truth, I assure you, 'pon honor. My friend Brainard compliments me too highly. No, perhaps he don't either. Flatter myself, when I have a little business on hand, there's no satisfying me till it's accomplished. Can't be done, sir, can't be done." And Mr. Badger struck the table with his fist to render his language more impressive, and at the same time give a sidelong glance at Mr. Brainard. "Mr. Brainard," said Mr. Clinton, rising, "my visit was merely one of accident or civility, and as I find you engaged, I will do myself the pleasure of calling again." Mr. Brainard was too much relieved to oppose Mr. Clinton's departure, although Mr. Badger seemed greatly disposed to do so. Mr. Clinton, however, declined the polite invitations graciously given to him by the latter gentleman. "Badger, you will ruin me!" exclaimed Brainard, flinging himself into his chair. "You give me no peace. You are my evil genius. You always interfere with my brightest prospects." "Very sorry, my dear fellow, very sorry. Didn't mean anything of the kind. Quite a mistake of yours. Here comes Mr. Ellery. Ah, Mr. Ellery, how do you do? Just in time to comfort the afflicted. My friend just wishing for you. I know he was. See it in his face." Mr. Badger was certainly possessed of the power of divination in this instance, for Brainard was much relieved by the entrance of Mr. Ellery. "Ellery, let me say a word to you." Brainard drew his friend aside, and then said in an undertone, "That fellow will ruin me at the very moment when my wishes are on the eve of accomplishment. Read this letter from Esther Clinton. She said that her mother has discovered our engagement and opposes it, but that she will fly with me to the utmost ends of the earth. Her father was here a moment ago, and found this fellow sitting here with a cigar in his mouth, gloating upon his prey. Now, my friend, can you not assist me with the loan of $100, which will satisfy Badger for the present? If Esther remains in the same mood, you shall be repaid before next Sunday." "Well, really, Brainard, I don't like to refuse you, but this is quite out of my line. I have only just money enough for my own expenses. Couldn't you raise the wind in any other way?" "Impossible! I am the most infernally unlucky dog. Out of those cursed Jews I have got all that I can get, and unless you help me, I do not know which way to turn. Remember that your money will be repaid to a certainty, for Esther swears that she will marry me. I never do anything of the kind, Brainard, but rather than see you miss your chance, I will venture to satisfy Badger for this once. But remember, there is to be no delay. You are to take Miss Esther at her word, and that instantly. Thank you, thank you. Trust me, I shall do as you desire. Mr. Ellery approached the table, and, writing a few cabalistic words on a piece of paper, presented it to Mr. Badger, at the same time handing him his hat, and saying, "Mr. Badger, you must excuse us at the present. Mr. Brainard is not very well." "Certainly, certainly. Brainard, my dear fellow, hope to find you better when I call again. Must get well. Good morning, Mr. Ellery. Brainard, good morning to my dear fellow. Speedy recovery to you. Speedy recovery." "And now, Brainard," said Ellery, "play your cards well. Be sure you don't miss a trick. I believe in my soul that if you had not made such a fool of yourself about Miss Walton, you should have been married to Esther before this. Ah, Miss Walton, do not mention her." "What? So tender on the subject yet? A pretty fool you would have made of yourself if you had married her. I agree with Keats that love is a hut with water and a crust. Is love, forgive us, cinders, ashes, dust?" "Yes, but I never thought of marrying her. I could not. We will not talk of it at present. By the way, I intend upon calling on Miss Adair this morning. 2 strings are surer than 1. Miss Esther may take a turn of filial heroism, which will miss 1 string. I shall still have another to draw my bow with." "You will have to draw a pretty long bow to bend it with the last one, for Miss Adair is not wanting in shrewdness. But pay her your devoirs this morning by all means, and just imagine her Arria Walton, will you?" "If it were only Arria herself," sighed Brainard. "Tush, man, you are mad. Get ready, and I will walk part of the way with you." While Brainard was seated close by the side of Miss Adair upon her little sofa, for the sofa was intended to hold 2, his thoughts reverted frequently to Mr. Badger, and at that very period, by some strange chance, Mr. Badger's thoughts were entirely engrossed by him and his interest. Mr. Badger had returned to his dingy office, and was in the very act of waging war with the cobwebs which delicately tapestried his walls, when Mr. Clinton honored him with a visit. Mr. Badger threw down the broom, and acquitted himself in sustaining the part of a host, much to his own satisfaction. Mr. Clinton entered into conversation, and soon made several ineffectual attempts to ascertain if his host had any knowledge of the state of Mr. Brainard's affairs. But Mr. Badger was a man of honor. There were cases, some few cases, where he did not think it necessary to make public the concerns of his intimate friends. Mr. Badger's surprising indisposition to be communicative more than ever awakened Mr. Clinton's suspicions, and he was determined to satisfy himself by stratagem if he could not do so by other means. "Perhaps you are not aware, Mr. Badger," said he, "that I have some interest in this young gentleman. If there are any demands against him, perhaps I may be of assistance." "Say no more. Just the liberal sort of fellow I took you to be," said Mr. Badger, thrown quite off his guard. "Didn't know you had an interest in him, didn't I? Knew it all along. Knew your daughter myself. Pretty girl. Fine woman. Capital match. Capital."
"Then Mr. Brainard is somewhat embarrassed at present, is he not?"
"Up to his teeth in debt. Hand you his accounts in a minute. Do business for almost all the people he employs. Livery stable bill? Oh, poser. Write me a little check for that, and you'll be doing a good action. A good action. Just what I expected of you. Very much obliged. Here's a paper, sir. Here's ink. Pen don't want nibbing. Just the man I took you to be." "You must excuse me at present, Mr. Badger. On second thoughts, I fancy it will be best to talk this matter over with Mr. Brainard." Mr. Clinton, having obtained the information he wanted, rose and hastily left the office. "Why, the old hunks," said Mr. Badger, looking after him. "Didn't shell out after all. He's a deep one. Got all he wanted out of me, and never showed me the color of his shiners. Too bad, too bad. No gratitude. Write that man down as no gentleman."
Chapter 18. Such are thy dangers, yet if thou canst steer past all the perils, all quicksands clear, then mayest thou profit. Crabbe. It was not until after the hour of business that Mr. Clinton returned home, and when he had privately communicated to his wife the discoveries he had made, they summoned Esther. Without much preface, he portrayed Brainard's character in glowing colors to her, and pronounced him to be a worthless fellow and a needy fortune hunter, whose object in taking her as wife to better circumstances, declared that he would never consent to such a man's union with his daughter. "Then you must renounce your daughter," said Esther heroically. "He has been traduced. I have given him my troth, and should I break it, my heart must break first." Esther clasped her hands over the spot where she supposed her heart to lie, and, drawing herself up to her utmost height, stood looking at her parents with undaunted heroism. "Then you break our hearts, after all the love we have lavished on you," said her mother. "Do you persist in marrying a man who does not marry you, but your money?" wrathfully inquired her father. "That assertion is as great an insult to me as to him," referred the dutiful daughter. "Father and mother, your words are empty wind. I could not hope to escape the common lot. That I should be persecuted and my lover traduced, I always expected, but once for all, I tell you that my promise to Mr. Brainard I will never break, although you spurn me from your door." Mrs. Clinton burst into tears, and Mr. Clinton, turning to his wife, said with undisguised rage, "This comes from your fine bringing up. If you had given the girl some sense and not filled her head full of romances, I should not have cause to be ashamed of my daughter. You may thank yourself for her disobedience and insolence. You have got your reward." Mr. Clinton would have proceeded, but Rachel, who for a few minutes previous had entered the room, unnoticed, interfered. "My dear father, leave me with Esther. I have something to communicate which may make her change her mind. And you too, my dear mother, leave us a little while. Do not weep. All will be well. I am quite certain that you will have no cause for tears." For once, Mrs. Clinton looked kindly on her eldest daughter, and as she listened to these charming words, she kissed Rachel's forehead and said with emotion, "Do, Rachel, my good, kind Rachel, do persuade her, do influence her. She will make us all miserable." "I will, mother. Only leave us and take father with you." Esther stood gazing on the group until Mr. and Mrs. Clinton left the room, and turned a defying glance on her sister. "Rachel, tell you your words are idle. They cannot move me." "Perhaps not, my dear sister, but hear what I have to say. From what I accidentally heard of my father's conversation with you, I infer that you are engaged to Mr. Brainard. I am not more grieved than astonished to hear it. My dear Esther, you do not know the man. He is a double-faced villain. It was only a few days ago that Arria told me in confidence that he addressed her in the language of passion, and even— "She spoke falsely. I know Arria Walton well. She is duplicity itself.
This is the second time you have made her the cloak of your designs. Once you told me that she was engaged to Edgar Chadwick, and that was false. We all know. Now you assure me that Mr. Brainard is paying his addresses to her, and that is falser yet. I know.
Arria is incapable of speaking a falsehood, returned Rachel warmly, and at that instant she observed the carriage standing before the door, for at this hour her mother generally took an airing. She opened the window and beckoned to the coachman. "Richard, drive as fast as you can to the Lemmings. Give my love to Miss Walton, and tell her, if she is well enough, she will do me a great favor by stepping immediately into the carriage and coming here. Make haste, and you will be back before my mother is ready." Rachel closed the window, and the carriage drove away. "Esther, we will not talk on this subject at present. You shall hear from Arria's own lips whether I have given you a false account of Mr. Brainard's proceedings." Esther did not deign to make any reply, but, seating herself, opened a new novel she had just commenced perusing. Rachel took her station at the window, and awaited with impatience the return of the carriage. In less than a quarter of an hour it drove briskly to the door. Rachel ran into the street, and before the coachman could alight, she drew herself down the steps, and handed Arria out of the carriage.
"Nothing happened? Are you not ill?"
inquired Arria hastily.
"None, my sweet Arria. How good it was of you to hasten here! Come in quickly. How this keen air makes you cough!"
Rachel twined her arm around her friend, and tenderly supported her into the parlor. Esther looked up at their entrance, closed her book, and, folding her arms, said,
"Arria Walton, good morning."
"Good morning, Esther," replied Arria in her usual gentle tone. "My dear Arria," said Rachel, "I wish you to perform an unpleasant duty, but I know you will not shrink from it when you learn that you can be of service to us all. My sister is engaged to Mr. Brainard."
"Mr. Brainard! Is it possible?"
"Yes, and as I believe that his attentions are not altogether disinterested, and as I know that you can unmask him, I wish Esther to hear from your own lips that he has several times professed to be deeply enamored of you."
"Oh, Rachel, what I told you was for your ears alone. Forgive me for having betrayed your confidence. I did so in hope of benefiting Esther."
Esther cast a look of supreme scorn upon them both. "It is now your duty, Arria, to disclose what you would have otherwise kept secret. Tell my sister frankly, has not Mr. Brainard, in the plainest language, paid you his addresses?"
"I cannot deny that he has."
"And has he not done so lately, within a fortnight?"
Arria looked as though it gave her great pain to answer,
but the anxious expression of Rachel's countenance induced her unhesitatingly to reply, "Yes."
"Sister, you hear?" said Rachel.
"I hear and see all, and therefore I believe nothing. This is a well-contrived plot, but it has not succeeded. You have given yourself a great deal of trouble for nothing, Miss Walton."
"Believe me, my dear Esther, I spoke an unpleasant truth, but I spoke the truth only."
"I can believe nothing. I have pledged my hand to Mr. Brainard, and I will wed him."
Arria was confounded, Rachel in despair. While the latter was deliberating what course to pursue, the bell of the street door rang. Rachel darted to the window, as though she had a presentiment that somebody whom she desired to see was near. "Thank heaven! It is Brainard himself. Now, Esther, you shall have proof that we have spoken truly. Arria, you must remain here and receive him. Esther and myself will retire, and I think we may be justified in listening to his conversation."
"Oh, no, no, Rachel, indeed I cannot. You must excuse me. I am not strong. You must spare me this," said the agitated Arria, who could not endure the idea of witnessing Brainard's compunctions. "What, Arria, will you not save your friend from the miserable fate of becoming this man's wife?" "Pardon me, I hardly knew what I said. I will remain, but, indeed, I am unfit for the task." "If you would do a good action, you will render yourself fit," exclaimed Rachel with energy. The effect of her words was instantly visible upon Arria, who, until then, looked as though she herself the culprit. "Come, Esther, the door is opening. Come quickly, or it will be too late." Esther made some resistance, but Rachel, summoning up all her strength, forcibly drew her into the next room. The folding doors had scarcely closed upon them when Mr. Brainard entered. His astonishment was quickly succeeded by delight on beholding Arria. "You here, charming Arria? This is a joy unlooked for. What kind spirit sent you to gladden these eyes that have not been blessed since they last saw you?" "Mr. Brainard," said Arria hesitatingly, you... She looked toward the folding doors as though she could hardly restrain herself from warning him, but the thought of Esther's perilous situation put to flight the half-formed intention. She answered with more composure, "Mr. Brainard, this is not the language in which you should address me." "How should I address you, except in the language of my heart? Loveliest and best, a harsh fate may outwardly separate us. I may even be forced to wed another, yet we shall not, must not be wholly separated, Arria. My love will still be yours. Your love, tell me, shall it be mine?" Mr. Brainard had hardly spoken these words before the doors flew open and Esther burst frantically into the room, followed by Rachel. "Villain!" exclaimed Esther, "you are unmasked!" Mr. Brainard was appalled. He gnawed his quivering lips, without the power to frame a denial or excuse or a reply. The veil had fallen and could no longer hide the foul beast that it had so long concealed. Esther could not add another word. Her desire to be a heroine fled from that moment. She saw her errors and follies in their most glaring light. Her ingratitude to her parents, her injustice to her sister, her unkindness to Arria, and her whole life's infatuation. A mental mirror was held before her eyes, and one glance to her reflected self restored her to her reason. Regardless of Brainard, she approached Arria, and throwing her arms around her neck, sobbed, "Forgive me, I have been a fool." Arria warmly returned her embrace, and the exulting Rachel exclaimed as she beheld this reconciliation, "Esther is indeed restored to us. Now we shall be happy again." Meanwhile, Mr. Brainard had seized his hat, and, great as was his desire to sneak from the apartment unobserved, he feared he could not do so. Unintentionally encountering Rachel's eyes, he commenced saying, "This is some mistake. I have been misunderstood. You have for once been understood too well, sir," replied Rachel indignantly. "I wish you a very good morning, Mr. Brainard, and the next time you attempt to marry an heiress, be careful how you fall in love with her friend, and, above all, beware that you do not express your sentiments in a room with folding doors." "Miss Clinton, you will not hear me," said Mr. Brainard, determined not to fly the field without making a defense. "No, Mr. Brainard, we have heard enough to satisfy ourselves. I desire to hear no more. Good morning." Mr. Brainard could only acknowledge the dismissal by finding his way out of the house as quickly as he conveniently could. But, while he did so, he said to himself, "What a blow-up! Thank fortune there is one string left. I always feared that this one would break." Chapter 19. The thorns which I have reaped are of the tree I planted. They have torn me, and I bleed. I should have known what fruit would spring from such a seed. Byron. As the clock struck 3, on the day succeeding that which had been made memorable by the Clinton visit, Mr. Badger found himself opposite the Bowling Green. His business in that part of the city was not merely to pass judgment upon the fountain, or upon the fantastically uncouth heap of stones, to a very creative imagination bearing some slight resemblance to a cluster of rocks, over which the limpid Croton reluctantly, with a very visible effort, dashed itself. Yet, although Mr. Badger had affairs of importance to transact, he felt bound, as a patriot, to pause and survey the ingenious handiwork of his countrymen. After he had examined the fountain in every possible point of view, he stood before it exultantly, rubbing his hands, shaking his head, and occasionally giving way to a solitary ebullition of mirth, as he ejaculated, "Sublime! Sublime! Great country, this! Great country!" His admiration having thus vented itself, Mr. Badger thought it time to proceed to business. "Didn't intend to wake up the old woman on Pearl Street today. However, so near there now, better not lose the opportunity. Mordaunt's nearly settled. One more visit, hope to have done with him. Ain't a favorite customer, growls and shows his teeth like a full-bred Newfoundland. Managed to make the old woman hear. Got a cure for deafness here." Mr. Badger looked tenderly at his stout cane, as though conscious that nobody but himself was aware of its medicinal virtues. He turned quickly into Pearl Street, and stood before Mr. Mordaunt's inhospitable-looking dwelling. To try his strength and test his patience upon the rusty knocker would be but useless trouble. A better mode of gaining admittance suggested itself. An entrance through the basement might easily be accomplished, and to this passage he therefore betook himself. He unceremoniously made his wants known by applying his sturdy walking-stick to the door. He could hear the echoes ring through the deserted house, and they were his only answer. Mr. Badger was of a determined character, and a few obstacles only stimulated his energies. He bravely turned his back to the door, at the distance of a few steps, and permitted himself to fall heavily against it. This feat he repeated until the whole house shook, and the hinges and locks of the old door gave evident symptoms of resisting no longer. It was then that he heard something fall in the kitchen, succeeded by the sound of uneven steps tottering through the entry. "Be you going to pull the house down?" demanded Tabitha from within, but without making any attempt to draw back the bolts. Mr. Badger, probably indisposed to trust his voice, replied by once more dropping his whole weight against the door. "Lord have mercy on us! Don't be after doing that again. Who's there?" Mr. Badger answered as before, and this time a hinge gave way. "Don't! Don't!" screamed the old woman. "Wait a bit and I'll open the door. Oh, Lord! Oh, Lord!" Mr. Badger was too polite to refuse this request, and the door slowly opened, but only enough to make visible Tabitha's shriveled face. "How do you do? How are you, your ladyship? Didn't want to give you the trouble to walk all the way up the stairs. House full of smoke. Hey, what's burning?" The old woman had been so much alarmed by Mr. Badger's attempts to make a forcible entrance that she had not noticed the clouds of smoke that were gathering around her. "Lord have mercy on our souls!" was all she could say, and forsaking her post, she rushed screaming into the kitchen. "It's the little furnace upset!
I thought the fire was dead out of it. Oh, Lord, the house is caught!" Mr. Badger, although thick smoke had now rendered the passage so dark that he could hardly see, led by the sound of Tabitha's shrieks, groped his way into the kitchen. What a scene presented itself! The consuming flames darted up from a large portion of the floor, and were savagely climbing up the walls. Tabitha flew yelling around the kitchen, seizing pails and pitchers and jugs, everything that contained a drop of water, and throwing it wildly upon the burning floor. Mr. Badger caught up the swill pails and hurled their contents over the raging element, but the fire only burned more fiercely, and in a few moments more the terrified couple could with difficulty escape the pursuing flames by flying from the kitchen. "Fire! Fire! Fire! House on fire!" shouted Mr. Badger, leaping into the street. "Fire! Fire! Oh, Lord! Fire! Fire!" shouted the old woman, snatching her burning cap from her head and frantically pulling her singed gray locks about her face. In a few seconds a crowd assembled, but the house was old and decayed, and a large portion of it was constructed of wood, and before an engine arrived the flames were bursting through the lower windows, and an attempt to enter the house by the basement was impossible. Several efforts were made to force the street door, but the strength of the bolts within rendered every trial ineffectual. "No matter, there's not much there worth saving," called a man from the crowd. "Old Mowatt lived alone, and all his furniture wouldn't bring $20. "No such thing! No such thing!" shouted Mr. Badger at the top of his voice. "There's a lady! Got a lady shut up there! Oh, profligate, save the lady! Never leave a lady in trouble! Always save the ladies, I say! Save her, I say! Aren't there a man among you will save her?" he cried in a state of increasing excitement. Oh, Lord! He'll ruin us! Don't believe him! The house is empty! There's nobody in there at all! Lord!" interposed the old woman, alternately weeping, wringing her hands, and shaking her fist in Badger's face. "The woman ought to know!" cried one. "To be sure," replied another. Gentlemen! Screamed out Mr. Badger. "'Pon my honor, 'pon my soul, there's a lady shut up in there, at the top of the house! Gentlemen!" And Mr. Badger assumed the position of an orator, inciting his hearers to do some noble deed. A lady, gentlemen! A lady should never be overlooked! She's there! I know she's there! Saw her with my own eyes! A fine woman! Don't let her burn up! Never harm a woman!" As though to corroborate Mr. Badger's statement, at that moment a shriek, a wild, piercing, heart-rending shriek, the shriek of frantic despair, burst upon the startled ears of all present. So long and loud was that appalling cry that it drowned the din of voices, the noise of rushing feet, the crackling of the flames, and the busy sound of the engine. "A ladder! A ladder!" vociferated Mr. Badger. The ladder was procured and fastened to the side of the house, but the flames had mounted high, and were bursting from almost every window. The house tottered. To ascend the ladder would have been madness. Even the courageous and noble-hearted firemen drew back. In vain Mr. Badger loudly harangued the crowd, and pronounced the woman a fine woman, the finest woman in the world, and their country a great country. Not a creature would venture upon the perilous exploit. Jets of water fell plentifully upon the roof of the house, but the flames still mounted, and the ladder appeared worse than useless. Involuntarily the populace drew back, expecting every minute to behold the house fall, hurling the ladder with it, and perhaps burying some of them in the ruins. It was during that period of awful, agonizing suspense that Mr. Mordaunt himself burst through the crowd, with his mighty arms flinging everyone aside that impeded his progress. He snatched up a coil of rope, and with bare head and his features distorted by fear and horror, fixed his foot
firmly upon the ladder, and ascended with the speed of a wild animal. The ladder scarcely reached the attic windows. Mordaunt fiercely tugged at the blinds of one of them, but they were secured within by a secret lock that he himself had invented for the purpose, and would not yield. Dropping one end of the rope and holding the other in his hand, he clambered to the top of the house and disappeared through the small door that opened onto the roof. It was a fearful moment. The flames were already bursting through the blinds he had tried to force. In an instant more the roof must fall. The crowd below held their breaths during his absence, and every eye was fixed upon the spot where he had last been visible. Just as they began to despair of his return, his head reappeared, and with a leap he was once more upon the scorching roof. His left arm clasped an apparently lifeless woman, and with his right hand he tightly grasped the rope which he had fastened within the attic. Creeping to the edge of the tiles, he carefully suspended himself from the roof in order to reach the ladder. A suppressed murmur of dread rose from the crowd as they beheld his fearful position. Should the rope give way? Should his foot miss the bar? He and the helpless being in his arms were lost. He swung boldly round and touched the ladder. His fingers unclasped themselves from the rope, and, with the rapidity of thought, he descended. A loud, hearty cheer greeted him as he reached the ground, and 100 hands were stretched forth to hurry him to the opposite side of the street. Mechanically, he permitted himself to be carried along, and he had hardly reached a place of safety before, with one tremendous crash, like the peal of thunder, the house fell, and the lurid flames danced exultantly over the ruins, and shot up their tall wreaths to the reddening skies. Piteous to behold was the appearance of Mr. Mordaunt, as he stood supporting himself by an iron railing. His face was blackened and scorched. The clothes were burnt from his shoulders. His feet were without shoes, his stockings badly singed, and blood flowed profusely from his lacerated hand that had grasped the cord in his dangerous descent from the roof. One arm was still tightly twined around the unfortunate woman he had periled his life to rescue, but she was uninjured and appeared totally unconscious of her situation. The flames had not touched one tress of the long shining hair that fell in dark clouds to her knees. The white robe that fluttered about her attenuated frame was unscorched, and though her face was hueless, it was not with terror, for her eyes rested vacantly on the gaping crowd that gathered around her. She passed her thin fingers through the locks of her face, and lifted them back, and smiled. "Is she mad?" whispered one. "I suppose so. Perhaps the fright has crazed her." Mr. Mordaunt caught the sound of these words, and they roused him from the lethargy into which he had fallen. "Oh, a carriage! Will somebody have the goodness to procure a carriage?" he gasped forth, as though in acute pain. A carriage was soon at his command, but before he could enter it, Mr. Badger caught hold of his arm, and saluted the lady with a bow.
"How do you do, your ladyship? How are you? Hope you aren't hurt. It was I, your ladyship, told the people you were there. Didn't believe me until you let 'em know yourself by screaming, 'Right, right!' Always make oneself heard when one wants assistance."
Mr. Badger then turned to Mr. Mordaunt.
"What a pickle you're in, hey? Saved her, though, didn't you? Oh, you old profligate, who'd have thought it? Who'd have thought it? Never saw your match in all America. Great country, this, great country, greatest country in the world."
Mr. Mordaunt extricated his arm from Mr. Badger's grasp, lifted his companion into the carriage, and with difficulty crawled in himself. "To Mr. Lemming's, 8th Street, number... Make haste, coachman."
What number did he say? Must keep the run of him. What number?"
The coachman pushed Mr. Badger aside, closed the door, and mounted the box. As he was lifting his whip, old Tabitha, who had followed her master, ran forward and tried to clamber up behind the carriage.
"I'll help you. Always help the ladies," said Mr. Badger,
gallantly coming to her assistance and seating her safely as the carriage drove away.
"There you are. Now hold on. Aren't that sublime? Ha, 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 ha."
When the carriage stopped before the residence of Mr. Lemming, old Tabitha's ludicrous appearance quickly drew around it a crowd of idlers. Shouts of derisive laughter, mingled with hisses, rose on every side. The old woman, when she perceived herself to be the object of this ill-timed ridicule, sprang furiously from her seat, and rushed into the midst of the throng, and, with her shriveled arms, dealt about her a succession of blows, which would have turned the rabble's mirth to rage, had her streaming gray locks, her soiled and tattered dress flying in the wind, and her begrimed face been less calculated to prolong their merriment. The clamor attracted Mrs. Lemming to the window, and it was while she stood there that the coach door opened, and Mr. Mordaunt staggered into the street, apparently unable to support himself.
"Arria Walton," cried Mrs. Lemming, "look here! Your uncle just got out of this carriage, and he looks as if he had come out of the witch's cauldron, and sure enough he has one of the witches along with him."
Arria would not lose time by approaching the window, but flew downstairs to receive Mr. Mordaunt. "Uncle, good heavens, what has happened to you?" she said in a tone of alarm, as he leaned heavily on her shoulder. "The house is burnt to the ground. Do not mind me. Take care of her," replied Mr. Mordaunt tremulously, pointing to his companion, who still sat quietly in the carriage. Arria sprang into the coach, and, without questioning who or what the unfortunate woman might be, led her tenderly into the house. The singularity of her appearance Arria attributed to the accident she had just encountered, and the restlessly vacant look of those dark eyes might, she thought, be the effect of terror. As they entered the house, Mr. and Mrs. Lemming joined them. Arria hastily explained that her uncle's house had been consumed by fire, that he was injured, and the lady with him much alarmed, and requested permission to lead them to her chamber. "Certainly, my dear. How can you ask that question?" replied Mr. Lemming. "Lean on me, Mr. Mordaunt. I fear you are badly hurt."
"But who is that woman?" demanded Mrs. Lemming ungraciously. "She is the strangest looking creature I ever saw. Who is she?" "Probably some neighbor of my uncle's," whispered Arria, "whose friends may have been separated from her by the crowd, or perhaps have been burnt to death. Her intellect seems stunned by some sudden shock. Let me take her to my own chamber?" "I suppose it can't be helped now, but I don't admire taking people into my house whom I don't know," answered Mrs. Lemming. "I promise that she shall give you no trouble, but pray send for Dr. Chadwick immediately. My uncle needs care. There is not a moment to lose." Arria turned from Mrs. Lemming, and, taking the hand of her new acquaintance, conducted her to the chamber we have before described. "Are you at all injured?" inquired Arria kindly. The strange being whom she addressed, without appearing to comprehend her words, looked fearfully around the room, touched her long slender finger to her lip, and whispered, "Hush." That her reason wandered was evident, and Arria could hardly retain her emotion as she perceived it. "Will you not lie down? Sleep may restore you. See, this is my own little bed. Lie down and rest." Her words fell unheeded on the poor maniac's ears, yet Arria's voice seemed to have power upon her, for she bent her head to listen to it, and looked uneasy when the sound ceased. Arria gently drew her toward the bed, for she permitted herself to be guided like a child, and smoothed the pillow, and said, "You will rest well here." "Hush," again warningly whispered the maniac.
Arria was much enfeebled by the nature of her disease, but the energy of her will could at any time momentarily endow her with much physical strength. She stretched out her arms, and by strong effort of volition succeeded in lifting the light form of the stranger and laying her softly upon the bed. The maniac made no opposition to being placed in this recumbent position. Arria seated herself beside her, took her hand, and with a gentle motion smoothed back the long and tangled hair from her forehead. There must have been something soothing and composing in that touch, for over the staring eyes, that looked as though they were watching intangible shapes hovering about them, the lids slowly drooped, and at length closed, the limbs relaxed, and their nervous motion was stilled. The hurried breath came more evenly from betwixt those pallid lips. The sufferer slept. But how like death seemed that sleep! Surely life could find no fitting abode in that wasted form, but still lingered to take farewell of its olden tenement. The jet-black lashes that lay on her alabaster cheek, and the jetty hair that clustered in masses around it, gave to that still face the hue and aspect of the grave. Arria, as she gazed upon this image of death, could hardly believe that the rosy current still glided through the delicate veins that interlaced those blanched temples. How fearfully she must have suffered to become thus shadow-like, she murmured to herself, and tears of compassion fell upon the countenance over which she was bending. I feel drawn toward her, even more strongly than common pity should attract me. And why? Ah, is there not always sympathy between those who have suffered? How beautiful is even this wreck of loveliness! Certainly I have seen those features before, or some features that resemble them. Who can she be? A little moment longer Arria sat watching the slumberer, and finding that her rest was likely to be undisturbed, stole noiselessly from the chamber and hastened to that of Mr. Mordaunt. Mr. Mordaunt was extended on the bed, partially disencumbered of his garments. The writhing of his features denoted intense suffering, yet he uttered no complaint, and suppressed the groans that were struggling to escape from his lips. "Has not the doctor arrived?" inquired Arria of Mr. Lemming. "Not yet. We expect him every minute." Arria glided to her uncle's side, but she dared not touch him, lest she might increase his pain. "Dear, loved uncle, I know how dreadfully you are suffering, but you will be relieved soon." "Yes, very soon, and by the healer of all mortal sufferings," groaned Mr. Mordaunt. "Do not speak so. For my sake, do not. I should be alone in the world without you, uncle." "It would not be for long, my poor child," said Mr. Mordaunt in a softened voice, and forgetful of his own pain, while he scanned Arria's wan features. "You will follow soon." "If God so will," replied Arria. "But, dear uncle, I have not told you that the lady, I have left her asleep. Terror must have deprived her of her senses, for she appeared to me to be quite deranged." Mr. Mordaunt started up in the bed. "Deprived her of her senses? Who said that it was terror? Who knows anything about it? Who told you she was mad? Did she say I made her so?" "Oh, no, dear uncle, I only supposed her to be deranged, but her strange conduct may have been the effect of fear." "Yes, it was one of fear, of horror, of remorse. She shall not say I made her mad. She has made me frantic. It was my own act that blighted her existence, and my deeds, with her united, have blighted mine. They have withered up my soul and chained it to a hell here, while it was preparing me for a hell hereafter. And now the end is coming, but no future life can have torments in store more hideous than the anguish I have endured in this. I do not fear death. I hail its approach. I hasten toward it. The worst that may come cannot surpass the past." "His reason is wandering," whispered Arria to Mr. Lemming. If you could only sleep, uncle, you would be much better."
"If I could only sleep my last sleep, I should be better, for I should not then be upon the mental rack of suspense. I should know that the hour of retribution had come, and it would be too late to dread it."
Mr. Lemming, desirous of changing the current of the suffering man's thoughts, said,
"You have not told us yet who this lady is." "Not told you? You will know soon enough," replied Mr. Mordaunt bitterly. "I would tell you now, that your blood might freeze as mine does when I remember her history, but I have not the power."
He sank back exhausted upon the bed, and Arria made a sign to Mr. Lemming not to disturb him by further conversation. They stood in silence by his bedside until Dr. Chadwick was announced. Arria was then dismissed from the chamber. She immediately sought her own room, but, finding its occupant still slept deeply, she returned, and seated herself upon the stairs near her uncle's door, that she might have an opportunity of speaking to Dr. Chadwick as he passed out. In about half an hour Mr. Lemming came out into the entry, and, observing Arria, said, "The doctor wants more assisting in dressing your uncle's wounds. I am going for some of the servants." "Oh, no, I will assist," replied Arria promptly. "You? No, my child, it will be a very painful operation, and I should not like to try your courage by permitting you to witness it." "But who will assist so willingly, so gladly? You need not doubt my courage. Surely I can endure to see what my uncle is forced to bear."
"But your health?"
"Will suffer less if I am employed. You must not refuse me." Mr. Lemming opposed her no longer, and they entered the room together. Arria quickly silenced the doctor's objections to her services, and, seating herself upon the bed, calmly supported the head of her uncle while the doctors dressed the terrible burns that had eaten away the flesh from his breast, shoulders, and arms. Once or twice an irrepressible groan broke from the compressed lips of Mr. Mordaunt, but Arria firmly retained her position, dampening his forehead with some water that stood near when he looked faint, and when his courage was about to give way, whispering words in his ear that were more potent than any medicine could have been in restoring him. At length the operation was over, a composing draught administered to the patient, and the doctor retired, followed by Arria. "My uncle is very seriously injured. Do you think that his life is in peril, doctor?"
"That is a question, my dear, that I usually decline in answering to friends of my patients."
"Because it would excite them to hear it, but it will only relieve me to know the truth. I entreat you to answer my question."
"You are a perfect heroine, my young lady, and I believe I may trust you. Your uncle's, that is, Mr. Mordaunt's state is dangerous in the extreme. Yet if he is not attacked by fever, he may recover. I will return this evening."
Arria silently pressed the doctor's hand, and once more hastened to her chamber. As she opened the door, her first look was towards the bed, but it was vacant. The object of her search was sitting in a corner upon the floor, rocking herself to and fro, with her arms folded on her bosom, as though they clasped something invisible to her heart. "Hush," said she in a low tone. "She sleeps." "Who sleeps?" softly inquired Arria, kneeling beside her. "My own little one, my own, only child. She sleeps now, and look how she smiles in my face. But all last night I heard her wail, the whole night through. Oh, it pierced my heart, that low, mournful wailing. I hear it so often, nothing will drown the sound. Just so she wailed when they snatched her away. Hark! Do you not hear her? Is it not a piteous sound?" Arria thought she had never heard a sound so piteous as that of the voice to which she was listening, but she could distinguish no other. Again the poor creature by her side commenced rocking backward and forward, folding a fancied being to her bosom, and as she rocked she sung a sweet but hurried and broken tone.
Hide thee on thy mother's breast, hush that wailing cry. Safely, safely thou mayst rest, none but she is nigh. Rest, rest, rest. Hark, he comes that step, O me, never loose thy clasp. Closer cling, for we must flee, now we'll escape his grasp. Flee, flee, flee. She ceased, and sat silently gazing in her lap. Arria spoke to her, but she made no reply. How wrong I was, thought Arria, not to let Dr. Chadwick see her. When he comes this evening, I shall not forget it. Thank heaven she does not appear to suffer. End of chapter 19.